So the Chinese regime, you could argue, is expert at what's called unrestricted warfare or asymmetrical hybrid warfare. Sometimes it's described as that. In the US, you argue that we have a tool of this nature that is the kryptonite for the Chinese regime. So tell me about this.
What it is, it's a weapon that the Chinese leadership has created by itself. And basically it's the wealth which Xi Jinping and the top dogs in the Chinese Communist Party have amassed, both in China but particularly overseas. You know, the overseas real estate, the bank accounts, the businesses which they and their relatives own, their relatives with green cards who live in the countries they call their main enemy, and setting up bolt holes for themselves. But this is immense wealth. And the Chinese give some hints now and then about how much wealth has been moved out of the country, and it is in the many trillions of dollars. But as I said, it's the top people in the Chinese Communist Party who have really done well for themselves. And keep in mind that in China, by their own admission, there's about 600 million people who live on $5 a day. And there's a lot of people who live on a lot less of that. So how are they going to feel if the evidence of this massive theft by the top leadership is exposed? If, for example, America and, say, the Japanese and the free nations puts economic sanctions on China and they make life difficult. Well, in communist regimes, and like the Chinese Communist Party, they're glad to have the regular citizens absorb that punishment. Well, they do very well themselves, and they'll always have enough food and a nice place to live. So they're glad to sort of diffuse the pressure and the pain. But when the pressure is in fact exposing their wealth, that makes it very personal to them, and that could be a matter of life and death. You know, either lose their position or worse, because of popular unrest, popular anger over this. But even within that regime, there's all sorts of factionalism and infighting. Well, if you can use somebody's corruption, somebody's wealth and relatives overseas to expose it and bring them down, that is the one thing that I say that really scares them. And we've seen some evidence in the past of just how much it does frighten them.
Well, and we're actually supposed to be doing it, like cataloging this. Like the U.S. government is supposed to be developing a detailed report on this.
Well, they're supposed to, but apparently in the United States, that when Congress passes a law, compliance is voluntary, it seems. And what I'm talking about is a law which Congress passed in late 2022, requiring the intelligence community and the Secretary of State to produce an unclassified report on the wealth of the Chinese Communist Party's leadership. They had to do it within a year. So now they're well over, it's late, hasn't come out, they're well over a year late. So the requirement is there, and one asks, well, where is it? It hasn't come. But now one of the ironies is that the senator who pushed this piece of legislation the most was Senator Marco Rubio, who's now the Secretary of State. So one hopes that we will see this report. And then, of course, there is the question of actually doing something with it. That's the important thing, is not to just produce it and hope somebody notices it somewhere. But when you have the information, then you have to put it in front of the right people for consideration. And I would suggest the right people are the 1.4 billion Chinese, the vast majority of whom don't have overseas bank accounts, real estate, and the like. And that will be the real test. And I would point to around 2013 or so, Bloomberg actually produced an excellent report on some of this wealth and included the wealth of some of Xi Jinping's relatives. And I have never seen the Chinese Communist Party leaders respond the way they did. They were furious, and for good reason. And Bloomberg basically rolled over. But the point was made, and it showed the vulnerability that is there to be really to be exposed and to be used as a tool, actually.
Grant, I can't help but remember right around that time there was a series of reports that was done by the New York Times. This was as the Hu Jintao regime was making way for the Xi Jinping regime, but Xi had already, amassed his power this is thinking way back a good number of years, but they won a Pulitzer for this. They exposed the wealth of Wen Jiabao, and who curiously was, frankly, probably the only reformer of the bunch, and that I didn't hear as many protests about that particular exposure, and that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one conclusion to draw from that, or an inference, is that the Chinese leadership didn't mind having that exposed so much, because it allowed them to get rid of a troublesome person. But it shows how within those circles that there is this backstabbing and sort of what do you call it, fighting, that makes the exposure of wealth extremely dangerous for them. Yes, they might have been able to direct it in one direction in that case, but that can get out of control very quickly. And as I recall, I don't believe that they were delighted to have this exposed, but they were very sensitive that it only that they could make the case that, well, he's the only guy.
So, this report needs to be equal opportunity.
Oh, it has to be. And there's just so much to work with on it. It is shooting fish in a barrel. Getting the information is not that hard. Any competent financial researcher could do it. We spend $100 billion on intelligence each year. You think they should have some ability. U.S. Treasury is good at it when they put their minds to it. So it's not hard to get the information, but then getting it out is always that's trickier, but it's not at all hard. One idea that I've proposed is that to make it a sort of a weekly show. You can put it out on Voice of America or Radio Free Asia or some platform that's accessible. And you put it out every Friday, say Friday afternoon. And today it's going to be this guy. Here's pictures of his overseas homes. Here's his bank accounts. He's got this much money, et cetera, et cetera. And you could get all sorts of people interested, particularly in China, in dialing in to see, well, who's it going to be this week? And that would make a lot of people pretty darn nervous. And they say it's just one example of how you could put the information out in a sort of a fun way.